My name is Emily Cleghorn. I am so excited today to share my story of rising from the ashes and breaking generational cycles in mamahood after trauma. When I was born, I was abandoned by my biological mom at 7 months old. She took me to my paternal grandparents' house, dropped me off, and said, deal with her. I know that my mom wanted to give me up for adoption, and my paternal grandmother would not allow that to happen. I was a very sick infant. When I was born, I had severe asthma, and my mom already had two other children. My siblings in my mom's family were all 2 years apart, exactly. So she had her hands full, giving her the grace that I would give any mama. So she dropped me off when I was 7 months old on the doorstep of my grandparents and said, deal with her. And that was essentially where her role as a consistent ended. She showed up every now and then, inconsistently, whenever it fit for her. And so I grew up living with my paternal grandparents and my dad from 7 months till 6 years old. When I was 6 years old, my dad got married to a woman who had a son of her own. And at that point in my life, I was really close with my dad. I was daddy's little girl. I used to have a storybook that my dad had published and written just for me. And it talked all about how we used to go to the park, we used to go for drives, we used to go for chocolate ice cream, and just all of the things that were really special for us. And then when he got married, I wanted to go live with him, and my grandparents didn't see anything wrong with that. And so that's where I went. It didn't take very long for me to realize that was probably the worst decision I could have made. I lived with my dad, my stepmom, and my stepbrother for about 18 months. And during that time, I was abused in all of the ways: physically, emotionally, sexually. During that 18 months, I was only allowed to eat what my stepmom put on my plate, and I wasn't allowed to have seconds. I wasn't allowed to stay home on weekends. I lived in a bedroom in the basement, unfinished basement. I learned during that time how to be hypervigilant because I had to be for my survival. Whenever my dad wasn't around, my stepmom would take it upon her to beat on me. I can remember there was one chair in the living room that I was allowed to sit on. I would sit there in the mornings after I got all ready for school, just waiting for the time to go out and wait for the school bus. And it just so happened to be placed in the room in a way that my stepmom had to walk past that chair to get from her bedroom to the bathroom. And so on her way by, let's just smack Emily. It didn't matter at mealtime if I was still hungry after I ate all my supper or all my lunch. I wasn't allowed to have more. I have school pictures of me from first and second grade where my hair was chopped off in a mushroom cut, and I was so skinny you could see I had dark circles under my eyes and my face was sunken in. And I remember other adults in my life at that time looking at me saying, Emily, you look like you're from a concentration camp. When I would go on weekends, I was cycled through different family members' homes. So one weekend, I would go spend the weekend with my paternal grandparents. Another weekend, I would go spend a weekend with my mom. Another weekend, I would go spend a weekend with my aunt. And I would arrive there at those homes, whichever weekend it was, on Friday night, and I would go back home on Sunday night. Friday night, as soon as I got there, I would head for the fridge because my little tummy was so hungry. I struggled to learn how to read. I was focused on survival, not learning how to read. Learning how to read is not a survival skill. And making sure I had enough food, making sure I was safe. The whole dynamic between my dad and my stepmom was quite toxic. And she was not only abusive towards me, she was also abusive towards him. He was finding any way that he could to get out of the house so that he didn't have to be there. And so much of the abuse that was happening at the hands of my stepmom and at the hands of my stepbrother was done when he wasn't there. I'm not sure really that my dad knew what to do to protect me. He knew that something was wrong. He did defend me at one time when my stepmom was calling me it. He spoke up, and that's the only time I really remember my dad speaking up and advocating for me. My stepbrother found magazines and somewhere in his mind thought it was okay to force me to remove my clothes and use his fingers to take my virginity. He broke my hymen and it never re-intact. I do believe that my stepbrother said that if I said anything, he would beat me. And in the instances where he was harming me and violating my personal space, I was super attentive to how he would behave. So I could tell before anything happened what I needed to do to distract him. And if I didn't comply with what he wanted, he would punch me in the stomach. And this kid at 7 years old was much bigger than I was because his food wasn't restricted. He was bigger and stronger than me. I was scared. I thought that it was my fault. He was hurting me because I did something wrong. That's what I believed. And so I didn't say anything. My dad walked in on my stepbrother hurting me, and he got really mad, and that's where it ended. And then one Sunday evening in November of 1997, wasn't too far off of Christmas. I was at my mom's house and she told me to go get my bag ready. And at this point, I'm 7 years old and my stamina for putting up with the living situation I had been living in was wearing thin. And I had come to the conclusion that if anyone was going to save me, it was going to be me, because all of the adults in my life could look at me and see that something was wrong, but they weren't doing anything about it. So I went in my sister's room and I had decided that I was not going back. I didn't know where I was going to go and I didn't know how it was going to happen, but I was not going back. So I packed up my things, got all my things in my bag. And mind you, my mom lived in the middle of nowhere, but I was determined I was not going to go home that night. So I was so small, so scrawny, that I was able to fit under my sister's desk. And so I fit in the chair hole and I managed to get my overnight bag wedged in the chair hole so that nobody could see me. And I sat there crouched up. I don't know, it might have been an hour. To my 7-year-old self, it was forever. And my sister came in looking for me, couldn't find me. My brother came in looking for me, calling my name. Nobody could find me. My mom came in looking for me, hollered my name. I was silent. A while into this, my mom noticed my overnight bag. So she moved it and found little Emily. And what's going on? I'm not going home. Oh, okay. What am I supposed to do? Now I'm thinking, okay, you're the adult. And so she got on the phone, she called my dad, and he called my grandmother. And what I'm told the conversation is, Mom, Em won't come home. What am I supposed to do? And my grandmother said, bring her here. So that night I went back to live with my paternal grandparents. I was seeing a child psychologist because they suspected I had dyslexia because of the challenges with reading I had, but eventually that office closed and that stopped, and I didn't see any other therapist, or there was no discussion. In fairness, my grandparents were boomers and they didn't talk about emotions. They didn't know how to talk about emotions. I think I was 9 years old the first time I told my grandmother that I didn't want to be alive anymore because nobody wanted me and life hurt too much. And God bless her soul, she looked me square in the eye and said, we don't talk that way. So I didn't. I stuffed it all down to the point where in my teens, I started struggling with anxiety and depression. It started to impact my hormones. I remember I was in 8th or 9th grade and I started having 2 periods a month and I couldn't tell when they were coming. It would just bam. Of course, at that point, I didn't understand that that was my body's response to the ridiculous amount of stress that it had been dealt with. So my doctor's response, instead of looking for the root cause, was to put me on birth control pills. And I was on birth control pills for probably 12 to 14 years, which is not what they're designed for. But I think the first time that I had heartburn, I was 6 years old at an amusement park, and I was like, what is this fiery stuff in my throat? I didn't have the words to explain it. I was so young. And that was my body's response to stress. And so the digestive issues, the hormonal issues, those intensified as I got older until I was in my mid-20s I found a naturopath who sat and listened to me, which is the first time a healthcare provider ever listened to my whole story, and explained to me how the stress that I was living in as a little girl, that I had been storing up through my teens and my early 20s, was impacting my entire body. Like, I dealt with infertility for the first year and a bit of trying to conceive. This has been something that I've dealt with on some level my entire life. And it's something that I continue to deal with because the physical impact of that level of toxic stress is long lasting. When I was in my teens, I made the decision that I didn't want to be a mother because I didn't want to repeat the cycle that I had lived. But when I met my now husband, and he informed me that he wanted 3 children, and I was like, no, I don't want any. And then my fear of abandonment kicked in. I was like, well, I better give this guy 1 kid so that I don't end up abandoned again. I convinced myself to have 1. I did have 2 kids. In retrospect, I look back and that was the moment my life was saved, when my daughter was born. Because without her, I wouldn't have been aware of how much healing I needed to do. And the stress and the trauma and the cycles would have just continued, and I would have been blissfully unaware. I remember back when I was 6 years old going into the child psychologist's office, and there was this moment of life-defining clarity that I had that stuck with me to this day. I remember I was walking across the parking lot going to my appointment, and I remember thinking, I'm not the only little girl who has a mommy and a daddy who don't know how to love her. And it's not right that other little boys and other little girls have mummies and daddies that don't love them. They didn't ask to be here, and they don't deserve to be on because their mommy and daddy don't know how to love them. And someday I'm going to help them. And at that point in my little life, I didn't know how that was going to happen. And all through my teen years, I had a fascination with understanding the statistics for kids who grew up in situations like mine, understanding how the statistics work out for repeating the cycle, for future trauma that childhood trauma survivors are susceptible to. Recently, I've done a lot of research and understanding into how trauma survivors are more susceptible to autoimmune disease. Understanding the impact of childhood trauma on an individual has been something that has fascinated me from a very early age. I was not a normal child, but I knew what my examples were. I knew what I didn't want to give my kids. And I didn't know how I was going to get there, but I knew that I had to do the opposite of what was done with me. So instead of losing my mind yelling at my kids when they're throwing a temper tantrum, respond differently. Instead of gaslighting my kids, respond differently. It's my job as their mom to heal my junk, because if I don't heal my junk, they inherit it and they don't need my junkyard. I've discovered that one of the biggest keys in healing trauma is learning how to nurture and care for your nervous system, and learning how to identify my emotions and where I'm feeling them in my body and how they come up, and all of these things that typically you learn as a child, but I missed that boat because I was in survival mode. And teaching myself how to give myself grace and give my nervous system grace, because so often we're expecting, or I'm expecting myself to be calm in a situation that may not be the most calming of situations, and my nervous system doesn't know what calm feels like. So giving myself grace, not beating myself up, and reconnecting with my nervous system and understanding what it's going through and how it's feeling and how those emotions are coming up and where they are in my body, and learning how to release them There have been aspects of the events that I lived through that were right on the surface. They've been addressed time and time again because trauma is very much like an onion and there are so many layers to it. It's not a one and done kind of a deal. Sometimes you have to deal with it more than once. There are other issues like the residual damage of the sexual trauma, things that I didn't understand as a little girl that play into intimacy in a marriage that I'm still working through. And I am so thankful that my husband is patient and tries to understand what I'm working through, because for a long time, that was buried and it is just now coming to the surface because my body feels safe enough to allow it to come out. There are aspects of a traumatic event that will not come to the surface until your body feels safe. And that is it for me. I've written letters to him in my journal, but that's as close to him as I have gotten since that marriage ended for my dad. I know that when I go home, I worry about running into him and his mother. I know that he has a little girl of his own, and I pray that she is safe. My dad knows it happened, but he doesn't know how to express the emotions around it. He doesn't know how to validate it, I'm guessing, based on how things have gone. I know that the events that I lived through, as hard and horrific as they may be, sharing my story and reclaiming my voice is empowering for me. But I've also heard stories from other women who have heard my story, who have been filled with so much gratitude to me for being vulnerable and sharing my story. And so if I only help one woman, then it's worth sharing my story. That's how I'm helping the kids like me, is through sharing my story and empowering them.